Welcome to BIA, Canada's top black media provider. Whether you're looking for shows on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best content the black community in Canada has to offer and so much more. And better yet, do you have an idea for a project you'd like us to help you with? We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.
All right, everybody. Greetings. Good morning. This is our final class session for our yearly cycle. We are in our last course, Early History of the African Renaissance from 1896 to the present. And this is our last session, week 8. And we're going to be talking about the African Renaissance today. Where are we at in this phase of African history, of African world history, Renaissance Africa, or as they called it, ancient Egypt, which is what we'll talk about in our next course, which starts our cycle all over again. The Wame-Misu. Wame-Misu is the ancient Egyptian word for rebirth, or phrase for rebirth. So we're in this period of early history of the African Renaissance, 2022. What has the last 20 years been like in the African world as we move toward African Renaissance? So that's going to be our discussion today. We're going to talk about the steps forward and the steps backwards for African people over the past 20 years. Not everything, but some of the major things that have occurred in the African world. And then we'll take a break, and then we'll talk about how technology in the youth of the African world, because when we talk about Renaissance, we're talking about a youth movement. That's not saying there's no place for our elders, but in just the nature of the things, the youth are the future. So what we're talking about, the people that are going to push forward the African Renaissance are the youth. And we're going to talk about how active they have been in this youth movement in the African world and how they've helped push the movement toward Renaissance forward in collaboration, learning from their elders, working with elders, but pushing it forward because they're going to inherit the African world as we all age and get older. So those are the discussions for today. And then at the end, we'll have open discussion as always, where we'll talk about, again, where we're at, the history that we've all observed over the past few years, and where do we think the African people are going, the African people at home and those abroad. So, we ended last class talking about the establishment of the African Union at the end of the 20th century, the move of the OAU to the AU. And we talked about seminal figures like Thabo Mbeki, who in the past, 3 decades has been one of the main architects of, the concept of African Renaissance. Nnamdi Azikiwe wrote a book called Renaissance Africa. Nkrumah used the term before. I think Garvey used the term. Cheikh Anta Diop used the term. But in the past 30 years, Thabo Mbeki has been one of the key proponents of this idea of African Renaissance. And he talked about the victory over apartheid in the early 1990s being owed to all of Africa and the rest of the African world fighting to get this last vestige of colonization out of Africa. So Thabo Mbeki, South Africa is where we'll start. And if you remember back in week 1, we started with South Africa and the story of Charlotte Nkeke bringing Africa together. And we're going to end with South Africa. We talked about the CERT Declaration last week, and we talked about the OAU to the African Union. So, and we talked about the key place of Muammar Gaddafi in this process, who was the brother leader of the Jamahiriya of Libya. The Jamahiriya was the political term created by Gaddafi and others in Libya to describe their type of politics, which translates to the state of the masses. There was a very interesting political system in Libya. It was compulsory democracy in Libya, if you can believe that or not. People were forced to vote, forced to participate in politics, and it bore fruit. Libya had the highest human development scores in Africa from the 1990s all the way up until 2011. We'll talk about today what happened in 2011. But he again comes to this realization in the 1990s that he needs to be a proponent of the ideas that Nkrumah put forward in the 1960s, a United States of Africa, unified foreign policy, unified economic policies, more Africans solving African problems. So him, Thabo Mbeki, President Wade of Senegal, and others, even to some extent, Museveni from Uganda, to some extent, were pushing forward this idea of a stronger African Union. So, what did we have at the beginning of the 21st century in Africa? We had 54 or 55 countries, depending on how you count, because Western Sahara is always contested. It's this territory that's officially controlled by Morocco, but some African states support its independence from Morocco, so sometimes it counts as the 55th state. At the time, at the beginning of the 20th century, the civil war was still going on between the southern part of Sudan and the northern part of Sudan that would culminate in 2010, 2011 with South Sudan's independence. But at the beginning of the 20th century, that wasn't the case. So Sudan was one. So we had 54 countries. They all got together. Thabo Mbeki is president of South Africa. He follows Nelson Mandela from 1999 to 2008. And it's during this period that the African Union is being established and the different institutions of the African Union are being fleshed out by leaders led by Mbeki, led by Muammar Gaddafi and others. So what is created? They create a Pan-African Parliament. So they're going to take 5 representatives from each of the 54 countries. 2 of them have to be women, and they're going to meet to try to solve some of Africa's problems. Now, it doesn't have the power of a true parliament, because Africa is not a United States of Africa, but it's an institution to kind of get the ball rolling on that idea that if we can have 5 representatives from each country come together, we can democratically come up with some answers to some of Africa's problems. An African Court of Justice was created. During this time, the International Criminal Court was established on an international level to, prosecute people for war crimes and genocide and crimes against humanity and all these things. But it started to become clear that although these types of crimes are committed all over the world, most of the people that were being prosecuted were Africans. So a lot of African states had problems with this. They said, instead of letting the international community, The Hague and the UN prosecute African war criminals, we can do that in Africa, because that way it won't seem as though Africa is being singled out. So the African Court of Justice was established. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights was strengthened, and other institutions were built. The African standby forces were created to deal with the conflicts in Africa. Africa said, instead of having the United States or France come in or to interfere in civil wars in Africa, we can have an African standby force, what Nkrumah had called for in the 60s, where every African nation donates troops and we can solve Africa's problems internally. These things were being created, were being fleshed out. A new headquarters was built in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, to hold the African Union. New trade agreements were being created. The regional economic communities that exist in Africa. You have ECOWAS, which all the countries in West Africa are in ECOWAS. It's like a miniature version of the AU. And they're actually a lot older than the AU. In East Africa, you have the East African community. In South Africa, the South African Development Conference or committee. In North Africa, you have one. So these regional groupings were created, and they established their relationship with the AU. So you had a lot of positive movement on the economic front, on the political front, particularly economically. In the first decade of the 21st century, African states, if we're looking at macroeconomics, were growing at a pretty good rate compared to the rest of the world. Now, that's not saying that human development increased, but at least macroeconomically, states were doing quite well in terms of their economies. And the problem was it just was unequal in terms of who was benefiting from that in terms of the populations of certain states. But things were going well. When the world went into a recession in 2007, 2008, Africa actually grew. It was one of the only regions in the world to actually grow economically during that last Great Recession. So the African Union was doing some things, and they made it a point to do away with that old OAU adage, which was non-interference. Back in the day, the OAU said we won't interfere in each other's politics. The AU said, no, that's not good for Africa because the problems in one country tend to spill over into others. So we're going to solve Africa's problems together. We're going to use diplomacy. We're going to use military intervention if necessary. That happened in the Congo. That happened in Sierra Leone, Liberia as well. You had African forces, either from ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, or the AU that helped solve some of these problems. So things were on the up and up. Then in 2007, we get this. We get this because Africa can never just be left alone. Africa can never just be left alone. It's too strategic. It's too strategic. Africa has all these natural resources. The region here, known as the Horn of Africa, is connected to the oil-producing states in the Gulf. So that's a strategic area. We all know the story, or we know the propaganda about the so-called Somali pirates, or the actual young people in Somalia that were protecting their coasts from pollution and protecting their shores from untaxed traffic. So because of the strategic nature and the power of Africa, the United States, the leading imperial power, the leading neo-colonial power in the world, established AFRICOM under the guise of fighting terrorism, global terrorism. The United States, after 9/11, starts this global war on terror. And part of that, or part of the justification under that, was the establishment of the United States Africa Command on October 1st, 2007. What this was, a number of African countries voluntarily, and some, prodded by the U.S., to establish military bases in Africa, which is actually against the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. There's a part in there that talks about African states should refrain from allowing aggressive military foreign bases on African soil, but nonetheless, a lot of these leaders disregarded that part of the charter. So the U.S. Africa Command was established, and the first officer in charge of AFRICOM was an African-American named William E. Ward. And you can see him up there with Paul Kagame, one of the leading war criminals in Africa. If you ask certain folks from the Congo, you ask certain people from Rwanda, the people that he has imprisoned for questioning his regime. He's been in power since 1994, since the end of the Rwanda genocide, and he's used proxy wars in Eastern Congo to make his regime rich, while at the same time causing chaos in the Congo. So you can see, and he's a big ally of the U.S. So you see him here with Paul Kagame, you see him getting awards, and it's interesting that they were using African American and a black man to be the first general in a U.S. strategy to control Africa, AFRICOM. So if we, and this him again, this is propaganda from the AFRICOM site. You can go to the AFRICOM site and you can read everything that AFRICOM does in Africa because they don't even attempt to hide it. So this map just shows you the presence of military bases, military training operations that the U.S. has throughout the world, but particularly throughout Africa. A lot of this underneath AFRICOM. So just imagine this. I mean, the best way to look at things like this is to flip it on its head. So we know in the United States that Black people are disproportionately killed by police. Same thing in Canada. The report just came out in Toronto and one for Ottawa about what's going on with police brutality. So we know that the United States, Canada, a lot of places in the Americas, but we'll focus on the United States for this example, has a problem protecting the human rights of Black people. They're disproportionately killed by police. What if Nigeria said, you know what, because of this, we don't think that you're capable of protecting Black people's rights. Therefore, Nigeria is going to put a military base in Chicago. And Nigeria is going to put a military base in Philadelphia, and we're going to train United States military officers to better deal, and police officers to better deal with black people. Do you think the United States would allow Nigeria to put a military base in Chicago, in Los Angeles, in Philadelphia, in Detroit? No, of course not. But Africa is supposedly unable to solve its own problems. Africa needs military assistance. African militaries need guidance from US military officials. So a lot of the leaders, neo-colonial leaders, have allowed Africa to be opened up to these aggressive military bases, starting in 2007. But this was all part of a goal to control the strategic areas in Africa, as well as to make sure, as has been the case since independence, that Africa remains dependent on the West. Because what the African Union was designed to do, what Gaddafi, what Thabo Mbeki had in mind with the African Union, was to finally end the dependency of Africa on the West or on the outside, anybody, for food, for aid, for any of that. Gaddafi even went so far as to say, you know what, in the early 2000s, Gaddafi looked around and he said, telecommunications is going to be incredibly big. Telecommunications is going to be incredibly big. Africa needs its own satellites, because to put a satellite into space, you know, for everything, for internet or GPS, all that stuff, that costs money. And Gaddafi said, instead of renting, you know, satellites and not having control of the satellites that the West has, we can just put our own satellite up. So if all the countries pitch in, we can get a rocket and put our own satellite up in the space, and we don't have to depend on anybody. These are the types of ideas that were flowing from Gaddafi's mind. He said we need to have one African currency, the Afro, so that we don't have to have our money tied in with the US dollar or the French franc or any of these things. The English pound, we need to have our own currency. AFRICOM is one of the initiatives, along with others, you know, done by the French, done by the British. Canada's involved in a number of ways to keep Africa dependent, to keep Africa in a state of dependency. We started to see, Thabo Mbeki was a great president. He served his 2 terms from 1999 to 2008. And then South Africa gets a new president. So we're going to stick with South Africa, because this is Jacob Zuma becomes president. And he's indicative of a number of the leaders in Africa at this time period and continuing today in 2022. It's the selfishness of this new breed. So 1994, Nelson Mandela becomes president. We know Nelson Mandela's credentials as an activist, political prisoner. He, for better or worse, negotiated the end of apartheid, and we can debate about how that went, but it ended. There's no denying that. We know Nelson Mandela cared for the people. Thabo Mbeki, same way. Jacob Zuma comes in. Jacob Zuma is this new class in South Africa. He's a representative new class, people that had fought for at the end of apartheid, and now they have benefited. They're the small minority of blacks in South Africa that have benefited from the end of apartheid, because the masses have not. And if you took our class on student movements a few weeks ago, about 2 months ago, you'll know what's going on with the young people and the masses in South Africa. Things haven't changed that much since 1994. So Zuma is part of this new class. They're golfing, they're making millions of dollars, and he becomes president in 2009. Even before he becomes president, he's involved in a scandal, because there's a sex scandal with him and all this stuff. But he becomes president. During his presidency, you get increased corruption and increased inequality in South Africa. So you get a trickle of black people getting money, but again, the majority of the black people are still suffering. The biggest thing that happens during Zuma's presidency is he voted for the military intervention in Libya in 2011. He voted for the military intervention in Libya. So let's talk about that, because this is one of the most important events that has happened in the past 20 years in the African world, because it has so many repercussions. All right. So here's the timeline of this. In 2010, a good thing actually happens. We have the beginning of what's called the Arab Spring. It happens in Tunisia. It happens in Egypt, and Syria. In Tunisia, it starts because you have the problem in Tunisia that you have in a lot of African countries. You have a young population, educated population that can't find jobs. The economy is horrible. And you had I believe he was a fruit vendor. Was that Egypt or Tunisia? No, it was Tunisia. He set himself on fire in protest of the horrible economic conditions. In addition to that, you also have a hip hop artist named El General, and he creates this song that just catches on with the youth and the activists in Tunisia. And Tunisia had a dictatorship that was a long time in power, and the Tunisian people, through nonviolent demonstrations and protests, they overthrew this dictator. And this was kind of the start of the Arab Spring. We see the same thing happen again in Egypt against Mubarak, the president in Egypt. So this is happening. And again, these are young people protesting against economic problems, and they topple long-time regimes. Well, in eastern Libya, in Benghazi, you have a similar thing starts. There's a protest against Gaddafi. Now, Gaddafi had been in leadership since 1969, but conditions are a little bit different in Libya than they were in Tunisia and Egypt. For one, the protesters in Libya are actually armed. The protesters in Tunisia and Egypt, they did these things relatively non-violently. They took over major areas, they protested, they had sit-ins, and they were able to change things that way. The protesters in Libya were armed, and they were from the region of Benghazi, which is incredibly important because in 1969, the king that Gaddafi had overthrown in a military coup was from Benghazi. So this region had always harbored ill will toward the Gaddafi regime. These armed protesters, and many of them were Islamic fundamentalists, start protesting the government and start attacking government troops. So if you attack government troops, what do you think the response of the government is going to be? They're going to return fire. And this is what Gaddafi's government did. But the Western media, which had always had a problem with Gaddafi going back to the 80s, presented it as Gaddafi's government is opening fire on innocent protesters. These protesters are just like the ones in Tunisia. They're just like the ones in Egypt. They are innocent, nonviolent people, and look at Gaddafi just slaughtering them. Therefore, we need to use what the UN has dubbed the responsibility to protect principle. It's not really a legal principle. It's just a concept that's been floated around in the UN and in international legal circles, but it's not really a legal concept. Essentially, the responsibility to protect doctrine says this: if there is a possibility that genocide or war crimes or crimes against humanity are about to be perpetrated on a population, it's the international community's responsibility to protect those people. So we don't want another Rwanda to happen. We don't want what happened in Eastern Europe in the 1990s to happen again, those crimes against humanity. We don't want any of that stuff to happen again. So therefore, the international community has a responsibility to protect. While they're arguing this, the US and NATO, the North Atlantic Trade Organization, which is controlled by the US, are trying to rally the troops because they know that they want to invade Libya and they want regime change. They want Gaddafi out. So one of the first things they do, and this is, again, what I'm telling you is not conspiracy theory because all this stuff is documented and the US talks about it now. So it's not even a secret. There was a guy named General Haftar. General Haftar used to be an ally of Gaddafi, but they fell out in the 1980s. He makes his way to the United States. He lived in Maryland, in the United States, paid for by US taxpayers' dollars for decades, all with the opportunity, waiting for the opportunity to go back to Libya to overthrow Gaddafi. When this started, the United States called him up from Maryland and said, hey, it's time to go. We're going to take you, put you on a plane, take you back to Libya so that you can help organize the resistance to Gaddafi. This is completely documented. You can look all this up. That guy is now one of the major players in Libya, and that's pretty much a war criminal. But they let him back into Libya, let him loose. In order for NATO and the U.S. to get the okay to go into Libya, they needed the approval of the UN, United Nations Security Council. Now, there are 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council: United States, England, France, Russia, and China. And then there are rotating members of the Security Council. Different countries are on the council for a couple of years, and then they switch out. Of the 5 permanent members, the United States voted to establish, the first vote was to establish a no-fly zone. They said, Gaddafi has an air force, and if he's allowed to use that air force, he'll crush these protesters. And so we need to make sure that there's a no-fly zone around Libya. But they didn't say that they were going to get Gaddafi out. They didn't put that in writing, that they wanted regime change, but that's what the ultimate plan was. So France voted for it, the no-fly zone. The United States voted for the no-fly zone. Britain voted for the no-fly zone. Russia and China abstained from the vote because Russia and China have relationships with other countries in Africa. They have relationships with Gaddafi, but they also have relationships with the U.S. and France. And it was almost a quid pro quo. They say, well, if we abstain from this vote, maybe something will come up where China needs some votes and you guys will abstain. So they play politics. They abstained. There were African countries on the Security Council, one of which was South Africa, one of which was the South Africa led by Jacob Zuma. When it came time for them to vote, Zuma said, we need to get rid of Gaddafi. I'm going to vote for this intervention in Libya. And he voted for it. He voted for the US and NATO to invade an African country, which they did. Once they got the okay, the US and NATO come in, bomb Libya, bomb it, support these protesters in Benghazi, which are known to be jihadists, Islamic fundamentalists, known to be anti-government, and they essentially overrun Libyan security forces because once the no-fly zone was put in, the U.S. bombed strategic areas in Libya, bombed Gaddafi's home. Gaddafi was ultimately captured and executed. It's on video, and the country collapses. Libya went from the highest human development index in Africa to one of the lowest in a matter of a year because of what happened. Infrastructure destroyed. Libya had one of the most beautiful countries in Africa in terms of clean streets, modern buildings, highways. Nobody rent was controlled by free for folks. Education was free. All these things, healthcare, gone, destroyed. Not only that, you have Tuareg massacre in Libya. I can never pronounce that word. It's the Tuareg massacre in Libya. One of the things Gaddafi had done, because Libya had so much oil wealth and they had work to be done in Libya, Gaddafi had invited Africans from all over the continent to come and live and build and work in Libya. And they were incredibly loyal to Gaddafi. His opponents realized that. His opponents were also racist. When they came into this time, anybody that was black was either forced to leave or was killed. We got reports of people being sold into slavery in Libya during this time. Black Africans from other parts of the continent. So all of this was under, and the people that did this were supported by the West, including America's president at the time, Barack Obama. So you got the black president supporting the people that are massacring black folks in Libya, all because they want to get Gaddafi out. But this didn't just affect Libya, the fall of the regime. Libya is incredibly strategic because all of the warfare, and that general that they unleashed, he started, there was still a civil war about who's going to take over after Gaddafi. It was a power vacuum. So they were still fighting in Libya, different factions fighting to control the state. All of those guns that were brought into Libya and the warfare that was unleashed created instability throughout this entire region of Africa that we call the Sahel. It's the area where the Sahara meets the grasslands of Africa, and it's incredibly volatile. And this just made it an even more volatile situation. The region has been having trouble, this entire region, for the past 30 years. And a lot of that is because of climate change. A lot of that is because of climate change. So you have a perfect storm for humanitarian crises. You got climate change. So if you're living on a grassland, and let's say you are a cattle herder, and now the grass is, the desert is encroaching because of climate change, so the Sahara Desert is going further south, you are losing grazing land. Then you got your neighbor who's a farmer. That's going to cause conflict between you two. And then when people are fighting over land and food and resources, it's easy to fall back on religious extremism. So you got folks in Chad, northern Nigeria, in Mali, in parts of Sudan, in Libya, of course, in Central African Republic, in Burkina Faso, in these places, Niger, that have adopted these Islamic fundamentalists. So it's not about Islam itself. It's about these twisted versions of Islam, this Wahhabi Islam that has come from the Gulf states into Africa, the Al-Qaedas and Al-Qaeda related groups that are falling back on religious extremism because of the economic problems brought about by climate change. So into that mix, all of these weapons that are coming from the war in Libya are now going into here. So you're seeing things like children being abducted in northern Nigeria. You're seeing things like the ancient city of Timbuktu being raided by Islamic fundamentalists in Mali, and so on and so forth throughout Chad, Niger. So climate change, the chaos created by the Libyan civil war, all without not necessarily climate change, but the other things being initiated by the West. And now with Gaddafi gone, the leading figure talking about African unification, just like the leading figure in the 60s, and Nkrumah was overthrown by the West, the leading figure in the early 20th century talking about African unification is overthrown by the West. It's not a coincidence, because that idea scares people. It scares people. So after 2011, we kind of see the African Union become a little bit weaker than it was. A little bit weaker than it was. Now that the Gaddafi, because Gaddafi was also putting his money behind a lot of these initiatives. In South Africa itself, we see the effects of this. So again, the increased corruption and inequality. The ANC, the African National Congress, which we talked about in week 1, which was established, Charlotte McKay was there, and we talked about the role played by the AME Church and the establishment of the ANC and the Pan-African connections and all of that, has become a corrupt institution now that they got power. People are living like millionaires. And instead of focusing to bring everybody in South Africa up, the leadership led by Zuma is becoming increasingly corrupt. You see all these corruption trials happening. Nothing made to put this more in stark imagery than the Marikana massacre in 2012. So a year after Libya. Miners had this platinum mine in Marikana were striking for better wages. And just like during the apartheid time, and this was very reminiscent and triggering for people that had lived through apartheid, the security forces mowed down a number of these miners who were peacefully protesting for higher wages, for workers' rights. And this was on TV. When this happened, many of the youth in South Africa are saying, wait a minute, we have a black government. You have these black workers protesting against this white-controlled company. Then through a little bit more digging, you find out that some of the leaders in the ANC actually had controlling interest in some of these mines. So you're seeing some of the whites leave space for blacks to get involved in the economy, but all to exploit the majority of black folks. So we'll let a few of you in the club, but everybody, we're not going to make this thing equal for everybody. So the Marikana mine massacre happens. This was kind of like a George Floyd type moment in South Africa. Many of the youth in the ANC, led by this man here, Julius Malema. Julius Malema was the head of the ANC's Youth League. Julius Malema, along with a number of the youth in the ANC, said, you know what, we don't like what our leaders are doing. We don't like what our elders are doing in the ANC. So we're going to split. We're going to form our own political party, the Economic Freedom Fighters. It's founded in 2013, all with the goal of finally creating an equal South Africa. They wear the colors red. They dress like workers. The women dress like maids. The brothers dress like workers. And as of 2012, so this 2022, excuse me, 2013, this was founded. 2022, they have 10% of the seats in parliament. And if you watch any of the videos for South Africa's parliament, they are the folks that often get kicked out of parliament because they refuse to listen to leaders that are corrupt. There's a big thing going on in South Africa right now with its current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, who had a role to play in the Marikana massacre. He actually, many people think he's the person that told the police to go in or had a role to play in that. But he's now the president of South Africa. He is now being investigated for hiding $4 million, US dollars, on one of his farms in South Africa. It's called Farmgate. You can look it up. Farmgate is the name of the scandal. And recently, as of like the past week, the economic freedom fighters have been in South Africa's parliament protesting this man and protesting his government. So the youth in South Africa, and we already talked about the Fees Must Fall movement and the Roads Must Fall movement in South Africa. So the youth are talking about finally decolonizing South Africa. Yeah, we may be free from apartheid, but we haven't decolonized the economic system. We haven't decolonized the educational system. So we're working to do that. And the EFF and other youth organizations, this generation of people that were born either right as apartheid was ending or completely after apartheid ended. Apartheid ended in 1994. You have a whole generation of people that have grown up in South Africa whose number one enemy isn't the white South African per se. It's the corrupt government that they're under, that they're willing to fight. They're willing to create a new South Africa better for everyone. So this is the new generation. And as we come back we'll take a break, Q&A, and we'll talk about other forces in the African world that represent this generation, this youth generation, that they're not neglecting their elders. They're looking back to the elders that represent true African Renaissance. The EFF are looking back at people like Steve Biko. They're looking back at people like Thomas Sankara. They're looking back at people like Garvey and Nkrumah. And they're saying, these are the folks that we want to emulate. So we're not disrespecting our elders. We just want the advice from the elders that are actually about that Renaissance and not about the exploitation. So we're going to talk about the youth movement throughout the African world and what's going on in 2022. So I'll stop there for any questions that folks have. Anything in the chat, Daniel? Anything? Anybody have their hand up?
Hand up right now.
No hands? Okay, anything in the chat?
Nothing in the chat yet.
Okay, so I'll give any folks any hands, any questions or comments? If not, I'll keep going. All right, I don't see any. Okay, we got one. Mr. Thomas, go ahead.
So, morning all. Once again, the whole idea as to how Africa is backwards, and we have been treated all along in many ways that Africa is just backward and like to fight one another. You can see now that integration comes from all sources. It's not just because we're backward, it's because we're held down, so to speak.
That's it. And there's social conflict in every society. No society is free of social conflict. The problem with Africa is our social conflicts get interfered with by other folks. So this is what we're dealing with. So that's a good point. I see some other hands. Who's next? Daniel, you.
Lusa, go ahead.
Thank you. This is just so flabbergasting. How much of this information is known to people? Because I blame the news media people, because the stories that we get out there, and we all follow Gaddafi as this evil person. You know, even in Kenya, nobody really saw Gaddafi as somebody like Nkrumah. really going on, and that the person that's presented as our enemy really isn't the enemy, and it still continues. Not just here, I mean, not in Africa, but even here today. We lap up the news, we just swallow it wholeheartedly without doing our own homework and trying to find out is the truth that they're telling me now.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm going to get into that in the second part because I think technology plays a key role in helping us to get closer to the truth than we had in the past, where we had to rely on these media outlets and these things to feed us information. I'll say this about Gaddafi. In this presentation, I don't want to present it as if Gaddafi was a saint. He definitely, certainly was not. There was things that happened in Libya. I think his family benefited too much from Libya's wealth. It wasn't as bad as in some places. Like I said, the numbers don't lie. The Human Development Index is there. You can see what that meant for Libya in terms of how people live. But jailing political prisoners, that type of thing. He wasn't a saint. However, if the Libyan people wanted to get rid of Gaddafi, the Libyan people themselves would have gotten rid of Gaddafi. That group that was fighting against him wasn't representative of the majority of the population. The majority of the population was fine. The majority of the population now, even having lived the past 11 years under civil war and transitional government, are begging. They're begging Gaddafi's son, Saif Islam Gaddafi, to become president again. Because they're like, wait a minute, when Gaddafi was here, yeah, there might have been some political prisoners and things, but we had free healthcare, we had free education, and not just free education in Libya. If you got into a program abroad and couldn't afford it, the government would pay for it. We had, jobs, we had rent control, we had all these things, housing. But now it's chaos. So I don't want to present it as if Gaddafi was a saint. None of these leaders are. But what happened to him and the picture that is painted, particularly in terms of his relationship with the rest of Africa, needs to be reassessed, and we got to get this information out because there's 54 countries, 55 countries in Africa. The vast majority of them are ruled by people that jail political prisoners, that benefit unequally from the economy, them and their families, and that by all intents and purposes are kleptocrats and dictators. Why just overthrow Gaddafi? Nobody did anything about Mobutu in the Congo. No one did anything, or no one is doing anything about Paul Kagame. No one is doing anything about some of these other dictators throughout the continent that existed and benefit from Western support. So let's not, the propaganda that Gaddafi was this horrible person that needs to be taken out, it definitely is coming from the West and needs to be reevaluated. I think I saw another hand. Thank you for that. I think I seen another hand.
Yes, it's mine.
Okay.
I'm wondering, because I think, we've talked about this in a few different court classes, just the ways in which the U.S. in particular is often at the helm of interfering with other nations' sovereignty, and recognizing that, a lot of this information is now going public, and some of it has been public for quite some time. I'm curious about why, has there been any, whether internal to the U.S. or external to the U.S., pushback on that kind of activity? Like, obviously, well, not counting those extreme terrorist groups, but have there been any internal activity within the U.S. to say, what, you're interfering with other countries' sovereignty? This is historically what you guys have done, and this needs to stop. Like, I'm seeing all of this information, but I'm not seeing any information on folks stepping up to the plate and saying, you guys are just as bad as anybody else.
Very little internally inside of the United States. You do have anti-war movements and peace movements in the U.S., but it's very low on the public agenda. So when elections come along, very few questions are asked about foreign policy in terms of intervention in other places. This past presidential election, there was a lot of talk about the withdrawal from Afghanistan and things like that. But even the folks on the so-called left in the United States, they don't push this for the leadership. So when Democrats get elected, because the Democrats are the so-called left in the United States, it's farcical. I don't even consider the left, but that's the left in the United States, supposedly. Nobody asked them about that. People love Obama, black folks, liberal white folks. They say Obama's the greatest thing since sliced bread. Nobody, very few people. There were some that questioned what was going on with the drone strikes in Somalia. There were some that questioned AFRICOM, but it's not on the public radar as something to be brought up during debates, something to be brought up during town hall meetings. So when it's only the immediate, how does this person affect my life in the United States conversation. So Trump, Bush Jr., when they were in, they did these things to Africa. In fact, Trump's isolationist policies actually, in a way, benefited Africa to a certain degree. But when Obama and Biden are in, and people just turn a blind eye to Africa. They turn a blind eye to Haiti. They turn a blind eye to what the United States is doing in South America. So that anti-war movement, that true left in the United States needs to be bolstered. They need to make the voices known more and be more consistent, not just when things like Libya happen, because that's the only way. And people in the U.S. don't see the connection because they don't take classes like this. This stuff isn't being talked about on any level. So people just aren't aware. This is one of the reasons why I love talking to you all and having these classes so that we can make more people aware of what's going on so we can get these things on people's radar when it comes time to pick new politicians or to question what it is that they're doing. So yeah, thank you for that. And I think with this next section, I think we'll get to a little bit of that because as people know, I'm very hopeful. But not long after this, so that was in 2012, 2013, the EFF was founded. This is the time period that we start to see changes in Africa. And I think a lot of the changes are a combination of two things. Youth with a new consciousness, a new global consciousness, and the technology to express that consciousness. EFF founded in South Africa. In Namibia, an EFF was founded, Economic Freedom Fighters. In Botswana, a version of the Economic Freedom Fighters was founded. And the youth in Africa are sharing information among each other. They're seeing these news reports. They're seeing things like, what's happening in South Africa is very similar to what's happening in my country. What's happening in Nigeria is very similar to what's happening. What the African Americans and Afro-Colombians and Afro-Venezuelans are experiencing is very similar. So they're sharing ideas and tactics. That's how the Arab Spring spread so fast. The technology, bringing people together over Twitter and Facebook and using YouTube videos to share experiences. This is how these things have spread all over the world. This youth movement all over the world. One place in particular, Burkina Faso, 2014, we see how this movement has manifested itself with the ousting of Blaise Compaoré. This man, again, is one of these snitches and silence. There's a whole class on him. He was the leader of the coup that ousted the great leader Thomas Sankara in 1987. We talked about Sankara. So Sankara was killed by this coup, and this was supposed to be one of his right-hand men, one of his compatriots. He ends up ruling Burkina Faso for the next 20 years. 30 years, actually, almost 30 years, 25 years. When he gets in, he reverses the policies of Thomas Sankara. Sankara had broke off relationships with France. Sankara was pushing for African unity, pushing for women's rights. Compaoré did none of that. I just love this picture of him and his wife and Obama. Like, this is not a murder. Well, you got two murderers standing next to each other, but some of y'all might get mad at me for saying that, but that's what it is. Anyway, he remained president from 1987 to 2014. But in 2014, the masses had enough of him. And when the masses get fed up, they can't be stopped. This is the reality that people don't realize. This is why those questions that you all asked about the news and how we change people's perceptions, because once the masses, the minds of the masses get changed and they put that into action, there's no stopping the masses. Once we get them organized, it's what Garvey taught us over a century ago. You have to get the masses. The masses said, we don't want him in power anymore. And they uprose. And they took out the pictures of Thomas Sankara and they used him as their symbol. And they say, this man, this great African leader that you betrayed, that you, along with France, killed, this is the memory that we want. So you had a number of Sankarist political parties rise up saying that they want to uphold the legacy of Thomas Sankara. The EFF, all the way down to South Africa, considered themselves heirs of a Sankarist legacy. So they uprose. And when they did, they forced him out. And he fled to Cote d'Ivoire, because Cote d'Ivoire is a known ally of France. Cote d'Ivoire has been an ally of France since independence, never stopped being it. This might be, the leadership in Cote d'Ivoire might be some of the most, I don't know how to say Uncle Tom in French, but that's what it would be. He fled to Cote d'Ivoire. But last April, this past April that just passed, he was convicted in absentia and sentenced to life imprisonment for the killing of Thomas Sankara. He better stay his butt in Cote d'Ivoire, because if he ever steps foot in Burkina Faso again, he's getting arrested and being put in jail for life in prison. So they finally convicted him. Now, people might say this is just symbolic, but it is symbolic, but it's a powerful symbol. And again, if he ever comes back, he's going to get arrested and put in jail for life. So this was a youth movement. This was a movement of the masses, a mass of workers, of women that said, you know what? Our country needs to get back to the policies and the ideas of our great leader. And need to get rid of all these Uncle Tom puppets that have just raped the country of its resources, sold our resources off to either the French or the Americans or the Canadians or even the Chinese. We need to get these leaders out. Sudan, 2019. The longtime dictator, Omar al-Bashir, is overthrown. By who? The masses. Led by women like Ala Salah. The woman in white, young woman, activist, took this famous picture, the protesters. And I love this picture because you can see what this movement looks like in the African world. It's a combination of young people, workers who are fighting for a better economy, a better economic future, women that are fighting not only just to get their countries back together politically, economically, also fighting against the patriarchy that we continually have to struggle against. But I love this picture because what do you see? You see the cell phones. For the most part, every week in this class, I've been talking about movements and meetings. Movements and meetings. Back in the day, we had to get people together. We had to meet up somewhere. You see, this week, week 8, I just said the African Renaissance, I didn't have any meeting connected to it because guess what? Now, meetings are still important, but you can organize and mobilize people using WhatsApp, using Facebook, using Twitter. So you see all these people with their phones out, taking the picture, organizing. All these people brought together to say, hey, we're going to meet up in this part of the city, and we're going to protest. We're going to stay here, and we're going to organize people to bring food. We're going to organize people to send us tips of how to protect ourselves from tear gas and all these things. You can mobilize people to get rid of these regimes. In Africa's other giant, one of Africa's other giants, Nigeria, where 1/5 of the African population lives. You got the End SARS movement that happened, that started in 2020. And you got Aisha Yesufu from northern Nigeria, this famous picture. So I love showing these sisters because, brothers, we need to step up, to be quite honest. The past 10, 20 years, the activism in the African world has been dominated by the sisters, which is a good thing. It's not a bad thing, but brothers, we got to step up. The End SARS movement, the SARS in Nigeria is the Special Anti-Robbery Squadron, portion of the police that have committed a number of atrocities in the name of protecting people from violent robberies. They have committed all types of atrocities, killed people, all types of acts of police brutality. And just like the hashtag Black Lives Matter movement was started by 3 sisters, and a lot of the activism around Black Lives Matter since 2014, again, that's a very important year in Africa, in the US, people using the resources to connect people these hashtags and these things to get these youth and others out into the streets to protest. This was the same type of thing, fighting against police brutality. It was a video of what the special anti-robbery squadron did to two young people, and that went all over Nigeria, all over the world. And this movement galvanized folks in Nigeria. And one main aspect about Nigeria has always been the ethnic divisions that leaders have played off of since independence. They keep the North divided from the Southwest, divided from the East, and even the minorities within those regions. But this movement spanned across ethnic groups. This is what was scary to some of the leadership in Nigeria. You had youth from the North, you had youth from the Southwest, from the Southeast, all together saying we want an end to this and also a better government in general. And Aisha Yesufu was one of the great organizers. Daniel, if you wouldn't mind playing that video of Aisha Yesufu, please. Make sure your sound is shared as well.
Death is not when you no longer breathe oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. For me, death is when you are afraid to speak the truth. You are afraid to speak against injustice because you are afraid to die. The day I will not be able to speak because I'm afraid to die will be the day that I truly die. My name is Aisha. I'm an active Nigerian. For 2 years of my life, I felt support for myself. Even though I've always been participating, I've always been vocal, I've always tried for the justice. But I've never got to the national level. I got it within the circle that I'm in, both in schools and people around me and all of that. So when I talked about it, and I got to the place where I had that financial independence, and I was like, look, I have got a problem. My finance is a problem. And I said to myself, there are children who are like me, who are going through what I went through. And here I am, I'm not talking for them, I'm not saying anything. I said, I'm going to put the next 40 years of my life to Nigeria. He's going to give me another 40 years. And so, every community what just happened. And on April 30th, we will launch for them. And I was there from that day. So for me, it's unfolding. Because I think I have built this nation with my silence all this while. Youth in other parts of the country, of the world, have an enabling environment where they thrive, where they are nurtured, where they are allowed to be people. But the youth in Nigeria are being wasted. They are being killed. And nothing happens. Still is impunity. And that's just it. What we all need to understand is that this protest is a protest for survival. When I see these people, these youth who are protesting for answers, I say to my generation, we feel that if we hadn't felt that they won't be there protesting answers, they don't have a great nation. They don't want to be on the streets being melted. They don't want to be on the streets being shot at. They don't want to be on the streets being teared up. They want to be having fun. They don't want to be enjoying their life. We didn't get their environment. Yes, they were able to come out niches that they are thriving in. And then they're coming again. And going after them, they're profiling them and say, why should they have cars? Why should they have phones, expensive phones? Because we didn't have all of this. They don't think that they can happen. I'm a Muslim, and I am somebody who believes whatever I'm doing, I try to do at least everyone to look at for me to get jam. Even when I'm at closing, I always get to give my Sharia speech. Everybody has the right to do what they want to do. At that moment, when I do, I was expecting a good end at any time. I'm expecting for the next generation of Nigerians that are not yet born, the way I will teach that others and not for me.
All right, thank you for that, Daniel. So just wanted to give you some video to go along with these activists. In Brazil, Nigeria has the most African people. There's about 250 million Africans in Nigeria. The next country is Brazil. Same type of thing, same youth movement. This time, Black Lives Matter in Brazil. More police killed. Well, I'll show a video which talks about that. But again, in SARS 2020, 2021, Black Lives Matter in Brazil, same time period, same tactics. Youth using technology, getting together, struggling against a fascist, almost neo-fascist government in Brazil, a shoot-to-kill government in Brazil. And the youth are organizing. Daniel, if you wouldn't mind playing that video from Brazil.
Dozens of protesters chanted, "Stop killing us," on the streets of Rio de Janeiro. Even the spread of COVID-19 in the country did not prevent them from demanding an end to police brutality in South America's largest nation.
We're here today because we want to leave. We're here today because we're tired of this genocidal state. We're here to say no more.
Yes. The names of those killed in police operations were read out loud. Most of them had one thing in common: they're black and poor. Police said protesters were throwing stones, so they confronted them with tear gas and non-lethal force. 2 weeks ago, a 14-year-old teenager, João Pedro, was killed by police during a raid in a favela. The autopsy report shows that the boy was shot in the back by a rifle while playing with his cousins in his room. In 2019, over 1,800 people were killed in police-related incidents. A surge of hundreds illustrates the long history of police brutality and a political leadership, including President Jair Bolsonaro himself, who vowed to take breaks to stop crime. This year already, over 600 people have been killed.
The increase in police brutality, is it because there is an increase in crime, or because now there is a discourse from President Jair Bolsonaro and the way he authorized it?
Because the government controlling the police prior to that Snowden, at least there was a discourse, at least they were trying to address the problem. Before that Snowden, the military police tried to reduce the amount of people killed. But when he came to power, along with the current governor of Rio de Janeiro, that changed. They said it was no problem, and it led to the police to kill more, so that's going to solve Rio's crime problem.
Human rights groups also say that the pace of killing is astounding.
If the US police get 3 people, 10 ways to you would have in the US at least 36,000 deaths per year.
People have not only been protesting in Rio de Janeiro, but in other cities as well. They say racism is already part of Brazil's reality, and President Jair Bolsonaro is making the situation even worse. So, I'll just hear.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Daniel. So, this is what they're up against in Brazil, but they're fighting and they're continuing to fight. And they're being joined by a new generation of Afro descendants in the Americas that got together in one of the last meetings I will talk about in Chile in 2000, in the year 2000. There was the meeting before the UN conference against racism that happened in Durban, South Africa. There was a meeting for every region, and the region of the Americas got together, and it was in Chile. And you had Afro descendants from Brazil, from Argentina, from Mexico, from the US, from Canada. They all got together and they said, we are going to use Afro descendants as our designation, as our legal designation. So you talk about Africans in the United States, Africans in Brazil, we are all Afro descendants. And the UN made 2015 and 2025 the year, decade of people of African descent. So what's going on in Brazil is being monitored by, and the activists are being supported by actors from all over the region. And the activists in Brazil are reaching out to activists in Africa. Because of this new technology, we're able to connect these movements. This is where the future of the African world is going. And it's these youth. And, in Canada, again, right here in Ottawa, the youth are organizing against police brutality, systemic racism, often being led by the sisters. We see the Justice for Abdi Rahman Abdi Coalition, the Ottawa Black Diaspora Coalition here in Ottawa. I'm just talking about right here in Ottawa, but it's throughout Canada. The youth are moving. They're fighting against systemic racism. They're using the wisdom of their elders to keep the fight in the streets, to organize. So this is happening all over the African world. We need to make sure that this is sustained. We need to work with our youth. And the last thing I'll talk about, so I always want to end on a good note. Afro-Colombia, Francia Marquez, who, if things go the way they need to go in Colombia, there's a runoff election right now, she might end up becoming the vice president of Colombia. We talk about African world history in the making. Even if she doesn't become vice president, you should know her story and her life. This is one of our shining examples of a modern shero, somebody that we should know about. Last video I'll play, Daniel, you play this to show our class, hopefully Vice President-elect Marquez.
The isolated village of La Toma was comprised mostly of descendants of Africans who were forced into slavery centuries ago. They maintained a fiercely independent living here by farming and by panning for gold in the Ovejas River.
We as a people came to have lands that were fought for by our ancestors. We have been in this territory as a Black community since 1636. I grew up along the shore of the Ovejas River, swimming, fishing, mining. The river was everything to me.
Francia Marquez began fighting for her community as a teenager. In her 20s, as a single mother of two, she found herself in the middle of a campaign to stop the government from evicting the people of La Toma from their homes, to make way for mining and agricultural development.
In the name of development, most of the rivers in this territory are poisoned with mercury and cyanide. Fish that are caught here rot in half an hour because the fish is already heavily contaminated. I decided I had to study law to be able to better defend the rights of my community. I had a lot of trouble paying for college. But I decided that academia can't just be for people who have the financial means.
Francia's education was abruptly interrupted when dozens of illegal backhoes began tearing up the mountainside, scouring for gold in the hills surrounding the village.
I was just a mining woman, and I didn't understand the legal language. I didn't know what a right to petition was or a bit to protect constitutional rights. But I believed that having gone to college allowed me to acquire knowledge and information that I didn't have before.
Francia organized the women of La Toma to march 350 miles to Bogota to protest the mining. Many of the women had never left their mountain homes, but they were inspired by Francia's courage. 80 women marched for 10 days and camped outside Congress until they were invited to a meeting with the Vice Minister of the Interior.
When I speak, it is from a place of justice, not only for Black people whose rights have been violated, but also for indigenous communities, women, and nature itself.
Francia navigated her way through the UN High Commission for Human Rights, Colombia's High Court, and Congress, until they finally managed the illegal mining operations. When the illegal miners didn't obey the government's order to remove the backhoes, security forces were sent in to destroy the heavy equipment. The price for Francia was high. Her Every move now is taken under careful supervision of armed security guards.
I have lived here all my life until 3 years ago when I had to leave because of threats against me and my family. But this is my land and I love it and its people with all my heart. This fight has not only been mine, but it has been the entire community's fight. I was the one who gave it a voice, and sometimes I went out and gave it a face. But we have done all of this together.
For outstanding environmental achievement for Central and South America, the 2018 Golden Environmental Prize is awarded to Francia Marquez, La Toba, Colombia.
All right, thank you, Daniel. So, you know, being from the States, you know, Kamala Harris is cool, but this is a black woman vice president that I think we can all be proud of. Because unlike Kamala Harris, she wasn't locking people up as a prosecutor in California. But anyway, this is the future. Activists, politicians in this mode that are going to get us out of this situation that we're in and push us further into the Renaissance Africa, the rebirth of Africa, African world. Because this is how I look at it. You know, 85% of us live on the continent, but the rest of us in the diaspora are going to benefit from a strong continent. So we talk about forward to Renaissance Africa. We got some challenges, we got some opportunities. And these are just some that I could think of as I was thinking about this. But you guys might have other opportunities and things that you feel are important. But for me, the challenges still remain. We still have anti-people controlled governments and economies. That's the biggest one. And I look at that as a bigger challenge than even the external aggression. Because we can meet the external aggression if we have leadership in our economies and our governments that actually before the people. Then we can meet the external aggression. But when you have internal people that are committed to theft, they're committed to corruption, then it's harder to do that. It's harder to fight the external aggression. It's harder to get those military bases out of Africa. It's harder to get those exploitative businesses out of black communities throughout the world. Not outside of Africa, systemic anti-black racism in Europe, in Asia, in the Americas. In Australia, where black folks are. This is what we have to fight against. And then unnatural climate change. There is natural climate change that happens on our earth. It happens every thousands of years. There's different climate change. We're talking about the unnatural climate change that's resulted from modern human global industrialization. This is a big threat to Renaissance Africa and African communities all over the world. So these are the challenges, but they can be met, and they will be met by our youth in conjunction with our elders. I have youth up here, but I don't want to be presented as if it's just young people on their own. It's young people being guided by those elders that have a Renaissance African mind, that are ready to pass down their knowledge, pass their information to the youth with the energy to actually make this thing happen, and who are the future. We're going to benefit from this Renaissance Africa. We have technology now that enables us, if used properly, to organize more efficiently, to mobilize more effectively, and to record, to have classes like this. I don't know where people are calling in from today, but we got folks usually from all over to share these ideas. So we got the technology along with the energy, and then of course the resources of the African world. You just saw what's going on in Colombia, the land that black folks control in Brazil, all the arable land in Africa that we still have under our control that we're losing because of some of these governments, but the resources are there. So we have all the ingredients for an African rebirth. We just need to put them together. We need a few things, and this is what I'll end with, what I always end with. I think African people all over the world only need 4 things. They're hard 4 things, but we only need 4 things. We need discipline. We need Iwa, which is character. We need long-term planning. And I forgot my 4th. And vision of what a Renaissance Africa will actually look like. We put those 4 things together: vision, Iwa, discipline, and long-term planning, and we can get out the situation. The AU has a plan. It's called Agenda 2063. It's going to mark the 100 years since the organization, the OAU, was founded. And there's a plan, there's an agenda of what they want Africa to look like, and it's a great plan. But do we have the discipline, the character, and the planning to achieve it? Because if we do, we'll have a generation of African people that will wonder, how do we ever, you mean we actually lived like that before this? Because Africa's great now. The African world is great now. We can get there. I think we will get there. We just got to continue to do those 4 things. So with that said, that's going to end our session. That's going to end this course, and that's going to end this cycle. I want to thank all of you for participating. We're going to start again in July. It'll be the exact date, whatever, not the date of Canada Day, but the weekend after. And we start the entire cycle of African world history over again. So we're going back to the beginning. And our first class is What History Left Out, Part 1, where we go from 10,000 BCE up to 711 CE. And we talk about ancient African history. We're going to have between 2022, 2023, we're going to have our core classes as well as some seminars. If you have ideas for seminars, things you want us to discuss, email me. Just let me know if there's ideas that you want us to look at. One of the most successful seminars we had, the one on snitches and sellouts a couple of Septembers ago, was an idea that came from the group. So if you have ideas for things that you want us to go more in depth on, send those. I want to thank Daniel for being a great teaching assistant and facilitator. He's going into his final year at the university coming up. So we're going to keep him on, and he's growing and supporting. We're going to be bringing more young people through the Coppin African Teachers Institute. So you'll hear some different voices next year as well. So we're going to stay consistent. We're going to stay here. There will always be a place, particularly for folks in Ottawa and anyone else watching, that every Saturday or most Saturdays of the year, you'll be able to get a little bit of African history. There'll always be a course website with resources that you can use, and we're going to stay consistent. I don't want there ever to be somebody in Ottawa to say, I didn't learn that. I wish I would have learned that. Well, here's your space to learn it, and it's controlled by you. Also want to thank BIA Media for a successful 8 weeks for this course, the setup that we have. Brother PJ has been here. You can't see him on screen, but he's behind having everything, making sure we look good, sound good, and all of that. So this is Black folks helping Black folks. Again, this is with Jaku Combat. So check out for our programming that's coming out from that organization over the next year in the summer. And again, thank all of you for your continued support. And we'll open it up to general discussions. We got about 15 minutes for any questions or comments about this or anything else that we are doing. So Daniel, you see any hands or anything in the chat? I'll go in the chat first.
Yes, there's a couple hands, but there's one question in the chat. Somebody said, I know the protests in and of themselves don't drive out dictators. What else takes place alongside the protests and marches that makes those movements successful in driving out dictators?
Protests, marches, non-cooperation with the economy, strikes. You have elements of the police and the military that get conscious as well in some places. So when you have that combination, then things start to move. When the police and the military are on the side, become on the side of the people, that helps. Or when the people just overrun them. I mean, it's rare, but it does happen. But that's all in combination with economic non-cooperation as well. So the people being in the streets, stopping the economy from working, all of those things in conjunction help get folks out. As well as external pressure too from the diaspora communities as well. So those always help. It's a good question. So we got hands, I guess. So who's first?
Nguza and then Gina.
Thank you, Clyde and Daniel. You spoke about the use of social media and technology business and mobilize people to get justice. This is what I use to get the real truth anytime I feel like I am being bamboozled and manipulated by mainstream media. And this is why Bill C-11 worries me so much. The new best buddy coalition of Liberals and NDP hastily wraps up the committee process on this controversial bill. Normally, there is a lot of time for debate, especially when there are over 150 amendments for discussion. But no, there is a worldwide trend to push through similar bills, and Canada is under pressure to push it through. Of course, it all looks very nice and pretty in talking about protecting Canadian content on Netflix and other streaming services. But the part of the bill that has caused the greatest alarm is the section that would give the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, the CRTC, government agency, the ability to regulate and censor what they call user-generated content. In essence, all our posts in the public scope. So right now, because it's already being pushed through the House of Commons, only the Senate can say this now. I don't know how the Senate is structured. If anybody is as concerned as I am, please find a senator and write to them about your concerns.
Yeah, thank you for that. I knew nothing about that. Wow, yeah, that is extremely troubling. Yeah, all you that vote, yeah, and please do, because wow, that's frightening. Next comment. Thank you for sharing that. And if you have anything in terms of resources or articles on that, if you wouldn't mind putting in the chat, I don't know if you have it in front of you, but I think other folks might be interested in learning about that. Okay, who's next?
Gina's next.
Okay.
Thank you. I wanted to provide an update, and I hope the folks in the room can hear me as well, on the needs assessment that we've been working on, right? With the active members of the work group for myself, Jennifer, who's not here today, and Jackie. And we've been working quite closely with India from OLIV. We had a very productive conversation with Carleton University's Institute for African Studies. And right now, informally, they have agreed to work with us to facilitate the forum at Carleton. So we don't have anything signed yet. They do have to go to, I think, their board of directors to get formal approval. So we're going to put something together for them. But they are very excited about the collaboration. We're very hopeful because I think they're also trying to grow, and it gives us, we're looking, what we pitched to them, what Matillion has pitched to them is effectively a long-term collaboration, which means we'll be able to do the forum on an ongoing basis for years to come, so we can continue a needs assessment and make it a sustainable process. So right now things are looking good in terms of securing a space, and I am providing that context because if we're going to do this, the last 2016 forum was 300 and something people, so we need a large space if we want to make sure that we are as inclusive as possible and make sure that we bring in a lot of the marginalized communities within the ATP community, like socioeconomically marginalized, etc. We need as much in-kind support as possible, and right now Carleton is providing a very substantive piece of that, which is the space. They'll also be providing students who can take notes in each of the breakout sessions that will feed into the needs assessment report. So those are two really big pieces, and once that's formalized, I'll share with the group in July. The other big pieces, many of you would have seen the city's anti-racism strategy that was released recently. Ms. Jennifer had reached out to them for a conversation because what we're trying to figure out is we're still trying to figure out how their work is, where their intersection between what we are trying to do for the forum, for the needs assessment, and what they have planned. I think a big question for us is how do we hold their feet to the fire, so to speak. Typically governments they can put out pretty speeches and great, media articles and whatnot around what they plan to do, what they actually do might be a very different thing. So we are hoping we've reached out to them for our conversation. Ms. Jennifer did that. And so I think we are well on our way to having a conversation with them, with someone next week. I think it's somebody from the Secretariat, I forget her name now, Suzanne Obiora. So that's where we're at. So far, if anybody needs more information, I'm happy to share the PDF of our meeting notes. We've had several meetings, and we will be reaching out to the community for volunteers once we have the space and the date confirmed.
Wow, thank you. That's a phenomenal update. Things are moving. Things are moving, and your work is well appreciated. The work that you all are doing, because I see the emails. Although I might not respond all the time. I see the work that you all are doing, and for those of you that are on the call, that are on the committee, you should know that this is all being done in good faith. There's a tremendous amount of effort being put into it, and hopefully we'll end up doing some good for our community here. So yeah, definitely contact Gina if you have any questions or if you want to get involved as a volunteer. Any other questions, comments, or concerns before we close out for the day? Anything up remaining, Daniel? Anything in the chat or any hands?
I don't see anything in the chat, and I don't think anybody else has their hand raised.
All right, so we'll end there today, and look out in your emails for information about our next session. Everybody stay safe, enjoy your weekend, and we'll talk soon.
Ottawa's Black Business Alliance, a place where you can learn to be your own person and build the future you want for yourself. Our mission is to help young entrepreneurs achieve their business goals through the best coaching, managing, consulting, and a slew of other services. Together, we can become a pillar in the Afro-Canadian community. Don't hesitate to contact us through our website at www.oba.ca, and remember that building tomorrow starts today. OBA Consulting. Take hold of your future.